Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at today and tomorrow in our final episode of our class on world civilizations. Y2K, the that time about 20 years from the time I'm recording this, when the calendar was going to turn over, we were entering the 21st century, and there was a lot of speculation as to exactly what happened, would happen. Computers really hadn't originally set up to make that turn. Little personal story: the elders in my church had been talking earlier that year about what would they do, and I sat back in my chair and I said, I think I'm going to invite you all to a New Year's party at my house. Sure enough, we had the party. And when the clock struck midnight, unbeknownst to anyone else, I hit the circuit breakers in the house, and the house was plunged into darkness. And I heard somebody in the crowd saying, "I knew this would happen. I knew it would happen." And I turned the lights back on, and everything was okay. So it turned out to be not much, just a little hiccup along. However, the following year, September 11th, 2001, there were a series of terrorist attacks, all uniformly taking place on that day. Four airliners were hijacked using very simple means, really. The hijackers had smuggled on box cutters, and they used these devices to hijack all four planes. Two of them, they crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. One crashed into the Pentagon. Another one probably was headed to another vital location and instead ended up crashing as the passengers tried to take back the plane. But this sparked off a whole new realm of terror activity. September 11th was certainly a huge deal, not just for the United States, but for around the world. And initially, this set off an invasion of Iraq, but a few years later, both the United States and UN forces, because it was a coalition, even if the United States was the primary player involved, they invaded the country of Iraq because Iraq had in turn, of course, in the past they had invaded Kuwait, and this had led to the first Iraqi war. But now, because supposedly there were weapons of mass destruction. Now, when you say weapons of mass destruction, are you talking nuclear devices or are you talking gas? Because there was gas that had been used against the Kurds in the northern part of Iraq. Whatever you mean by that, I'm not sure if everybody had a clear idea. But there was this invasion of the country of Iraq. Rufus Fears, the former professor at the University of Oklahoma, used to like to say that the Middle East is the birthplace of civilization, the crucible of conflict, and the graveyard of empires. The test is not yet out as to whether what's going to take place in the Middle East, because in a sense, the Middle Eastern conflict is still continuing even today, 20 years later. So yes, President Bush led the way into Iraq. Yes, it brought down Saddam Hussein. Yes, there was a change of venue, and yet the conflict in those various countries that make up the Middle East continues unabated. Some other issues that have taken place in the last 20 years. In 2015, the Supreme Court made a decision to legalize gay marriage in all of its forms within the United States. It was interesting that prior to this, when Barack Obama had run for president, he had been asked his opinion on this, and he had said outright, no, marriage is to be between a man and a woman. He changed his views, and the Supreme Court changed what was going to be the legal law of the land. It's right, always struck me as interesting. I think the Supreme Court has made some good decisions in the past. I also think they've made some terrible decisions in the past. And sometimes we get the mistaken idea that a right and wrong change with a Supreme Court decision. I think that's not a biblical view. A more recent development, a development that takes us right to our very doorstep. I'm recording this in the year 2020. Um, and at the very beginning of that year, we had the coronavirus beginning in Wuhan and spreading first into, throughout China and then around the rest of the world. As I speak, it's not entirely clear what's going to be the long-term repercussions of that, because history is much easier to see after the fact, and distance gives us perspective. You see, history is made by events, it's made by ideas, it's made by people. But this brings us to the idea of leadership. What are the characteristics of an effective leader? Again, I'm going to turn to Dr. Rufus Fears, and he suggests 4 basic areas that an effective leader has: a bedrock of principles, a strong moral compass, a clear vision of what he wishes to accomplish, and the ability to build a consensus. It's an interesting exercise to look at both past leaders, past world leaders, and present world leaders, and to see which one of those have a bedrock of principles, a strong moral compass, a clear vision to what he or she, I should say, wish to accomplish, and the ability to build a consensus. You might have 1, 2, or 3 of these, but if you don't have all 4, then it's going to be a leadership that is flawed. We've seen in the past in our class the various sorts of leadership. Notice monarchy I've put at the top, and we saw a history of kings going all the way back to the ancient world. Sometimes this descended into tyranny, and we saw that in the case of ancient Rome, where their kings had eventually become tyrants, and that caused them to decide, we won't be under a king anymore. Notice you go from a tyranny to an oligarchy. Oligarchy is where you have some key people that are in charge, and of course, one form of that is a republic, which was the oligarchy which Rome chose. It's also the sort of oligarchy which was chosen by the United States of America, patterned after Rome. But notice from there you can go to, and these aren't necessarily in any specific order, but perhaps they are. You can go to a democracy like Athens had. Remember, Athens had a democracy. Didn't mean that everybody voted, but it did mean that all free males voted. Or you can have also a ochlocracy, the idea of a mob rule. Everybody tries to have their say, and we saw that in the French Revolution. Now, discussing this, the same sort of format, Mark Twain, in his paper called Eruption, he said, every civilization carries the seeds of its own destruction. And the same cycle, and he's referring to this sort of cycle, shows in them all. He went on to say the republic is born, flourishes, decays into plutocracy, and is captured by the shoemaker, whom the mercenaries and the millionaires make into a king. It's interesting that he said this about 150 years ago, and yet we're looking at, and whether you like it or not, we're looking at it right now. Not necessarily a shoemaker, but a showman, a businessman, who has been made into not a king, but a president. He goes on to say the people invent their oppressors, and the oppressors serve the function for which they are invented. And again, I'm not defining who are the oppressors or the oppressed. That's for you to ponder and to consider. And yet we've seen that there is a tension between freedom versus equality. It's nice if you can have both, but usually to gain one, you're going to have to subsidize the other. You're going to have to sacrifice the other. And so, in a sense, you can see quite a great deal of history is seen in the tension between these two poles. Some final lessons we can learn from history. First of all, to understand where we are going, it sometimes helps to see where we've been. That's what we've been doing throughout all of these class sessions. We've been seeing where we've been, hopefully to give us a view of what tomorrow might look like. Secondly, our knowledge of any given past event is always admittedly incomplete. We've looked at the big picture, we've painted with a very broad brush, but no matter how deep we went, we were not going to see it all. First of all, because all of it's not always known, and all of it, even that which is known, cannot be told in a short amount of time. Thirdly, historians oversimplify. And I'm guilty as charged. I've been doing that throughout this course. But finally, we are what we are because of the past. And so it does help, I think, to get a picture of the past, even if it doesn't mean that I'm going to predict the future, but maybe I can have a better understanding of the present. And in doing so, maybe it will help me to make decisions about what tomorrow ought to look like. Finally, geography is the matrix of history. I started off this course talking about maps. I never really got away from that. And geography matters. It's not the only thing that matters, but it's where we live. And so geography is significant. It's significant to the entire story. It's the house, it's the blueprint of where you live. The principle of competition is a principle that we've seen throughout. Marx tried to say that it was just economic competition. Well, that is there too, but it's not just economic. When everyone owns everything, no one takes care of anything. That's something that Marx didn't get, and that's something that we saw particularly in the Russian Empire, the USSR. It was the grand failure of that experiment. And yet that experiment still continues in China. What's it going to look like in the future? We'll see. Human behavior changes. Human nature does not. People are the same, even if the things that we do sometimes are different. Ideas, though, are the strongest things in history. Even a gun, it's been said, was originally an idea. And so the study of history is also the study of ideas. And of course, I believe the greatest idea of all is the gospel of Jesus Christ, who came and died for our sins, rose again, and now rules and reigns, yes, in heaven, but our prayer is, Lord, may you reign on earth even as you do in heaven. And if we believe that, then it will change us. And I believe that there will come a day when every tongue will confess, when every knee will bow that Jesus Christ is Lord. That makes me, historically, something of an optimist. I don't know how it's going to take place, but I believe that it will.